Today's episode is a special live recording of To Save Us from Hell. This is our sister podcast about the United Nations, in which co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I discuss all things UN. Our conversation was recorded live on the Substack app. Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am your co-host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am the editor-in-chief of Global Dispatches and UN Dispatch, and To Save Us from Hell is a project of Global Dispatches.
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, and I teach and I do research and I write about the United Nations.
So, Anjali, today we have a couple of topics to cover in our show. The first will be the nomination of Elise Stefanik as ambassador to the United Nations, which appears to be on ice. And then later in the episode, we will talk about the ways in which Trump's anti-DEI crusade is impacting the United Nations, and doing so even in these very early days. It's been a wild ride on the domestic front, and we've seen lots of what's happening at the State Department and USAID, but we are now, I think, starting to see the implications of Trump 2.0 at the United Nations, even though we do not yet have a confirmed UN ambassador. So speaking of not having a confirmed UN ambassador, Politico reported this week that Elise Stefanik's nomination is apparently on ice. Now, to me, this is significant for several reasons, not least of which she was the very first person Donald Trump picked to be part of his cabinet, and yet she may be one of the very last individuals that's formally nominated and confirmed to her position.
You know, no one has ever accused Donald Trump of being a strategic genius, right? So he drew at least a couple critical cabinet nominees from the U.S. House of Representatives, where the very fragile House caucus has a one-vote majority at the moment.
Would have a one-vote majority if Stefanik is nominated. Right now, it's like razor thin as it is because Mike Waltz from Florida became the national security advisor. Matt Gaetz resigned right after he was nominated in an ill-fated attempt to become the head of the Justice Department. And now, just like the Republican caucus is so razor thin that if Elise Stefanik leaves her post in upstate New York, that would leave the Republicans in Congress with just a vote majority. And they are a famously unruly caucus. So Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, probably is an untenable position if he has just one vote majority. And so this is where and why Elise Stefanik, even having been past the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by voice vote with the support of Democrats, now appears to be languishing in terms of her full nomination.
That's right. The unruly House caucus cannot afford, essentially, to lose her vote if what they want to do is use that razor-thin majority to push through wildly unpopular domestic legislation. The only way to do that is by maintaining her seat in the House at the expense of her seat at the United Nations. There is an argument here, right? Like, as you said, she was the first nominated. She's an easy confirmation, right? She will be confirmed by the Senate. She may even be confirmed with Democratic votes, depending on how they're feeling at the moment, because her confirmation hearing, she sailed through with flying colors, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And if we were thinking like people who wanted to govern well, then we would say, they should confirm her early and send her out as soon as possible because she is very competent. Unlike the vast majority of Trump's other second administration cabinet nominees, she knows what she's doing and she knows how to do it. And she is committed to enforcing Donald Trump's foreign policy goals at the United Nations. So if what she wanted to do was produce good outcomes in the world, you would want to move her nomination up. And you would want to produce domestic legislation that was solid enough that you wouldn't need her one seat to push it through. But what we're seeing here is just an extension of the fact that they don't want to govern well. They don't want to produce good policy, right? Mm. They just want to enforce a particular vision of politics, society on the rest of the world.
And I know we're a podcast about the UN, but it's worth diving a little bit into the domestic American politics of this right now. So, as we said, there have been two Republicans that have already left to join the administration, both from Florida. There will be a special election to replace those seats in April. Meanwhile, if Stefanik leaves her post in New York state law is a little different, and it permits the Democratic governor of New York to set a time for when that election would be held. And presumably, Kathy Hochul, the Democratic governor of New York, would do the politically wise thing and delay that election as long as possible in order to maintain just that one seat majority for the Republicans. And in the meantime, the Republicans are trying to pass through what's known as a reconciliation bill. It basically like fast track a budget bill in order to do all of the wildly unpopular things that they're seeking to do. And it's already going to be difficult with just that 3-seat majority. But if that goes down to a 1-seat majority, then it might be impossible. And so those are overarching the domestic political considerations. I think that's guiding both the Trump administration and the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives right now. Now, Anjali, in many ways, you are the public intellectual who has known Elise Stefanik the longest. So take us inside what's going on in the district right now in upstate New York and explain, how do you know Elise Stefanik for such a long time?
I went to middle school with Elise Stefanik, and I would note again that I have not spoken to her or seen her since. But what I have done is, of course, maintained a healthy and terrified interest in her public career in the years since, because we went to middle school together. I'm from upstate New York, not from Stefanik's district, from one district over. I was just up at my grandparents' weekend before last, and there is a lot of local coverage about the fact that this is not a situation that is ideal for the people in her district either, because essentially what's happening is that they are delaying the possibility of an election that might let them get a representative who is going to serve their interests for a long time. Now, this is also the kind of crisis that puts Kathy Hochul at the center of domestic U.S. and foreign policy in two different ways, two different separate constitutional crises. Kathy Hochul and the arcane, batshit nature of New York state election law. And so, yes, the Democratic Party's incentive as an opposition, as a party that's trying to slow down the domestic projects of the Trump administration, privilege waiting as long as possible in order to call a special election so that someone else from a different party might be able to fill her seat. And in that sense, they are aligned in trying to hold off as long as possible in filling that seat in ways that may not be ideal for the residents of her district. And which in fact may be disaligned, politically reported with the local Republican Party's interests as well. They would like to get the seat filled with someone else as soon as possible. The flip side of that is that, there is an argument that the United Nations aspect of this is not proceeding any differently than it would be if she'd actually accepted the seat, because foreign policy is a place where the US president has a lot of latitude to do what he wants and to, by sort of unilateral fiat, be able to make one or another set of decisions about what should happen at the US mission to the UN. The difference is the kind of diplomatic capital that you could be building if you had the US ambassador to the United Nations there, as opposed to, career bureaucrats who are now being tasked in something that is sort of antithetical to the previous set of policies that they were tasked with enforcing and executing.
To that end, the person leading the U.S. mission at the United Nations right now is Dorothy Shea. And I'm just going to look to the left to read her actual title so I get it right. Chargé d'Affaires ad interim. That is who is representing the United States at the United Nations these days, and whose statements I see populate my inbox from the United States mission to the UN's press releases. I'm just going to speculate here for a second that potentially Stefanik's nomination may be withdrawn, that the Republicans on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue might realize that they are unable to govern with such a razor-thin majority, and that, in fact, they may be better off with her in the House. I think that would be bad for the UN for a couple of reasons. We've discussed this before, But one of the key benefits, if you're someone who, like us, sees value in American engagement with the United Nations, is having like a politically powerful and strong UN ambassador who is in the cabinet, who is close to the president, who can kind of relay the significance of the UN to the administration, who can potentially run interference from other parts of the administration that might seek to dismantle parts of the UN, because doing so would undermine her own bureaucratic standing within the administration. This is something that you and I have talked about a few times in the past, but given the circumstances right now, it's not out of question that her nomination may be withdrawn and may be replaced by someone who's less politically significant, who maybe is not at cabinet level. And we've already seen, for example, the USAID becoming subsumed to the State Department. In previous administrations, the Democratic administration, that was a cabinet level position. Now the agency doesn't even exist.
Well, it exists. It's just not functional, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to insist on this, right? We shouldn't talk about it like it's dead because drawing it down is illegal. So
Yes.
in that sense, it exists, but has been collapsed. So it's not functional, but the vestigial part of it can't be destroyed except by an act of Congress. But in this particular, I don't know what's going to happen, obviously. I don't know whether we're going to have a nomination or not. And I think as we learned time and time again with the Trump administration, both the first and the second times, it's very hard to predict from the strategic logic of cost and benefit what they will choose to do. Because their idea of cost and benefit does not necessarily map onto anyone else's idea of cost. It is the case, I think, that if what they want to do is maintain that razor-thin margin for as long as possible and push through as many damaging domestic policies as they can, they would be well served by leaving her in the House. However, I don't think we should undersell the fact, first, that it's very hard to tell what they're going to do. Just in general, right? Just as a group of people who are essentially like into 14 different agendas stuffed into a burlap sack. And the fact that she's very politically ambitious. I don't know that she sees her fate as being best served by staying in the House. Whether or not she has enough clout to have it make a difference in her career, I don't know. But as you observed when we watched her confirmation hearing and talked about it afterwards, Marco Rubio is not long for this administration, I would assume. It's hard to tell who would succeed him, but she would certainly be high on people, not in the House of Representatives, but certainly if she is U.S. ambassador to the UN. So I don't know. I mean, I think, something that we've seen in the meetings over the last couple of weeks at the UN is that the Trump administration's agenda is getting floor time at the United Nations without her there. So they can indefinitely run on this as long as possible. Lord knows they don't care about the efficient running of the government. So, that we could be in a sort of condition of like Schrodinger's ambassador for quite some time, I think.
So I would suspect that we are not going to know the answer to this question of when the nominee is going to happen, and a nomination is going to happen until after this reconciliation bill gets potentially passed, or potentially after those April elections in Florida to replace the two other Republicans who have left. So just for now, I think it's all very notable, and it was worth kicking off this conversation because, again, in like the spectrum of Trump nominations, she was like not a controversial pick. She comported herself, as you and I discussed during her nomination, like a kind of normie Republican, not like someone out of the kind of mainstream of what we've been used to. So she will win confirmation if and when that vote is cast, but we just don't know if or when that vote will be cast.
Part of the reason she sailed through the confirmation hearings so easily is because she did sound like a very normie Republican from like the pre-Trump era in many of her answers. She is very good at what she does, right? Like she had studied up the United Nations. She had made a diplomatic outreach to all of the senators on the committee, but they didn't push her that hard on some of these critical questions about the fundamental ways in which the Trump administration's foreign and domestic policies are misaligned with the goals of the United Nations and with what she was talking about. And so, yes, she would be high on the list of easy confirmations. Yes, she is probably the best possible outcome under a Trump administration for a UN ambassador. But that's largely because even the Democrats on the Senate committee did not push her that hard on you say X thing, but what does that really mean in a world of Project 2025, of wildly dismantling US foreign aid?
Let's move on to our main event today, Anjali, a conversation about the ways in which the Trump administration's anti-DEI crusade is already impacting the United Nations and what it portends for the future. And honestly, it is wild what we have seen thus far in these early days without even a confirmed UN ambassador. There have been really some canaries in the coal mine that suggest to me a profound realignment at the United Nations, potentially, because of how Trump is approaching questions about diversity and gender equality, two issues that permeate all corners of the United Nations, but put the Trump administration's anti-DEI crusade at odds with just the values and the core of the United Nations. And we've seen this already manifest itself at some arcane parts of the UN, sure to spread to others as well. So let us discuss. So let us begin with segment 2. So, Anjali, let me just kind of set up what I read and what Colm Lynch reported in DevEx, great UN reporter Colm Lynch, a couple of weeks ago at the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF's executive board meeting. The United States representative there objected to what are known as country program documents. These are essentially like country strategies for UNICEF programming in places where UNICEF works. So, for example, UNICEF staff will come up with a set of documents outlining strategies and programs that they think will improve the lives and welfare of children in, say, like Liberia. And the UNICEF Executive Board, which is a 36-member body composed of a certain segment of UNICEF's member states that is basically like the board that directs what UNICEF does. It's one of the key decision-making bodies at UNICEF. They're discussing these program documents, which are written by staff experts and sent up for approval. Usually there's some discussion, debate, but there's never like a contentious meeting about it. These things are approved by consensus. However, the Trump administration representative there systematically objected to references in these arcane documents to gender equality and inclusion. They said it ran against the Trump administration's stated policy of rooting out DEI. So the Trump administration put the alternative language to a vote, which forcefully rejected any, mention of gender equality, gender equity, or inclusion. They lost 35-1. So the documents were approved. But to me, again, this is a canary in the coal mine of things to come at the United Nations.
And we saw that both further reporting by Colm Lynch and then sort of echoed in reporting from this week at Newsweek, right? That this is a platform they brought not just to UNICEF, historically one of the most popular UN agencies, right? Both in the US and abroad, right? Traditionally led by an American, something that Elise Stefanik identified as being an extremely good value for the US in terms of its foreign policy that is sort of consistently identified by governments throughout the world as being an important part of multilateral aid and relief efforts, an important part of advancing collective shared goals for people. We saw it at UNICEF, so that gives us one sort of place where they're willing, in the most popular UN agency possible, to sort of trot out this platform. And we also saw it at UN Women. And it's hard to imagine an organization that is more fundamentally unable to extricate the kinds of language that they're objecting to from its fundamental goals, right? Particularly when we look at the sort of way that they talk about their sort of framework. They talk about gender ideology. which in its most simple form is essentially the claim that trans people don't exist. And they frame it as being in protection of women.
Mhm.
Not the way women's advancement works under the United Nations framework. It is not a sort of like biological
Yeah.
understanding womanhood that is on the table in aid, governance, development, peace, and security work. It can't be because that's not the way policy works. And
Mhm.
the fact that they are putting this ideology on the table as being the central thing in organizations, one, that are very popular globally, and two, where there is no possible way to do the work of the organization while adhering to these principles, I think, as you said, are two big alarm bells about the way they want to proceed.
And also, to me, just one of the biggest alarm bells of this all is that they've taken this step at a really kind of obscure UN body. I mean, you and I don't think the UNICEF Executive Committee is obscure, but in the grand scheme of things, the 36-member UNICEF Executive Committee is kind of an obscure body. And the fact that they would take like this anti-DEI agenda so deep in the UN bureaucracy suggests to me that they are prepared to go deep in the weeds everywhere at the UN about this, potentially upending just like working methods across the boards. I mean, one potential avenue I definitely foresee them bringing this is another totally obscure UN body, the ECOSOC's NGO committee. This is a committee of the Economic and Social Council. It's composed, I think, of like 16 members that basically gives credentials, grounds passes to NGOs to either attend meetings or just like eat at the cafeteria at the UN. Now, in the past, there have been, when I started like reporting on the UN and the George W. Bush administration, the kind of key defining issue of the George W. Bush administration social agenda was against gay marriage, was against LGBTQ rights. And at the NGO committee, the Bush administration would sometimes like team up with Iran and the Organization of Islamic States and Russia to block NGOs that advanced gay rights. And the first Trump administration, didn't seek to use the UN as a platform to advance its social agenda. And so that wasn't like much of an issue. But the fact that they've taken this to the UNICEF Executive Committee suggests to me that the UN is going to be a battlefront in Trump's political fight against DEI domestically and globally. And we can see it reach all far corners of the UN.
I mean, this is straight out of Project 2025. When you read their section on international organizations and the United Nations in particular, they note very specifically that the US should insist that staffing and policy be done in accordance with the values that the US is advancing, and that they should engage in a campaign to make sure the personnel in these agencies accord with their view of the world, and that they should withdraw from organizations where that's not the case, right? Where that's not happening. And so, that's a sort of like root and branch approach to shifting the nature of policy at the United Nations. And it is one that requires a much more significant expenditure of diplomatic and bureaucratic capital than we
Yeah.
saw in the first Trump administration. That was a situation in which, because there was less interest in remaking the fundamental nature of American foreign policy, of American domestic politics, right? There was a more of a like chaos to the approach that they occupied, either solid diplomat with traditional sort of liberal internationalist values like Nikki Haley, or a fundamentally underbaked diplomat like Kelly Craft, right? Invest very much trying to turn the
Yes.
organization down. It wasn't in Haley's interest. It also wasn't in Kraft's interest, but it wasn't in her capability either. And this kind of full scale approach bespeaks, I think, an interest in taking people who know how the system works, who
Yeah.
want alternative values, and putting them in organizations that are fundamentally so obscure to the American public in particular, but also to sort of like even other policymakers,
Yeah.
that it's possible to create much more upheaval than you would.
Yeah.
The same bet to some extent that they made when they said, who's going to notice if we collapse USAID?
Yeah. And again, like people like even around the UN might not notice their shenanigans at the UNICEF executive board. But I wanted to ask you this question as a peacekeeping expert, because, while initially these anti-DEI efforts will happen in somewhat obscure committees, I have to imagine that it might impact the Security Council as well, for the fact that one of the key functions of the Security Council is reviewing mandates of UN peacekeeping missions. Now, normally these are pretty standard conversations, debates. The Security Council will assess the performance of the mission and typically, renew its mandate without too much hesitation for a year or 6 months or whatever it is. However, included in every mandate of UN multidimensional peacekeeping missions these days are the positions of gender advisors, people who are dispatched to these missions to ensure that like gender equity perspectives are integrated into the peacekeeping mission. I have to imagine that the Trump administration might take aim at including gender advisors in UN peacekeeping missions if they're willing to go so deep in the weeds at the UNICEF country program documents.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that isn't actually deep in the weeds, right? It's front and
Yeah.
center. We've got, well, a couple of things on the table. The first is that over the last 20 years, since the end of the Cold War, we'll say, mandates have gotten longer and longer and longer, and they include all of these different provisions. They're called Christmas tree mandates in this framework. They include all of these different provisions that speak to women, peace, and security, right? That speak to HIV and AIDS, that speak to youth insecurity, right? All of these different dimensions that peacekeepers are addressing. And they are fundamentally liberal. They are fundamentally liberal because the organization is liberal. And so the model of peace that they are advancing is a liberal peace, in which, one of the key benchmarks of moving past war, for better or worse.
That was a free preview of our full episode. To unlock the episode, please go to globaldispatches.org and purchase a subscription. We rely on your support to keep this show going. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Save Us From Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us From Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.